Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everybody. We go closer and closer to spring, some nice weather coming up. I trust everybody had a good week. Before we start the show tonight, I just want to give the number out in case you have any comments on the show or input. The number here is 515-604-9344, and then they will be prompted to an access code, which will be 914-121#. So that number again is 515-604-9344, and then the access code is 914-121#. Hey, I just want to make a quick correction. My wife pointed out to me that last week, I believe I was mentioning something about the First Saturday devotions, and I mistakenly mentioned that you needed to pray a decade of the Rosary. So let me just clarify that you need to go to Mass, confession with 8 to 20 days, and all these that I'm going to mention now are offered up in reparation for sins against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And then after the Mass and confession, you need to do a complete Rosary, not all 15 mysteries, but just, for instance, the joyful mysteries, and all 5 of those, or the sorrowful, or whatever ones it is. And then in addition to that, it's not just a decade of the Rosary, but that mystery, whatever you chose. Then you need to meditate for 15 minutes on the mysteries of the Rosary. So if you did the joyful mysteries, let's say the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, the Presentation, and the Finding of the Child Jesus in the temple, you offer that up in reparation for sins against the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and then later on take 15 minutes or so of quiet time and just meditate, say on those joyful mysteries that you did. So, and that would complete your First Saturday devotions. Okay, so I hope I clarified that, and I'm sorry for that mistake last week. Anyway, to get on to tonight's show, we're going to talk about something that all of us have experienced, and tonight we're probably going to experience it also. And it's a very, to me, an interesting category is dreams. And what are we to make of dreams? We all have them, and we're told that even if we don't remember our dreams, that we still dream at night or when we're sleeping or napping, that we have these things, even when we don't recall them. And many people put a great deal of faith in their interpretations of dreams, and they swear by them. And others just kind of poo-poo it and say, oh, it's no big deal. So where as Catholics do we stand on dreams? We know that certainly with St. Joseph, whose feast day we celebrated last week, that he was told by the angel to not be afraid to take Mary as his wife. And he was given a warning that Herod had designs on Jesus' life, and they had to flee. So we see that in Scripture, and we'll talk about this later in the program, that dreams certainly can come from God. And in other cases, it's a mishmash of some psychological things we have and things that went on in that day in our lives, or maybe something a few days before. But we'll talk about that. A lot of information we'll get to comes from Catholic Encyclopedia. If you'd like to check it out and things like that, you can, because it's very well versed and explains a lot of things about dreams. Because when I talk to many people about dreams, there's a lot of inconsistencies in what we believe, and hopefully this will help us out on tonight's show. I sure hope it does. And anyway, so in sleep, there is something mysterious, and from the earliest time since we've been here, it's impressed man, and it's aroused his curiosity. And what philosophy of sleep that sprang from the observation of phenomena, who knows? So we don't have a clue what, those early people began as a philosophy. But like all phenomena, the causes of which are not obvious, sleep came, and in the course of time, to be considered as the effect of a divine agency and as something sacred. So, that was a natural progression of early man. You look at some of what they thought of the stars and the planet and the very earth on which they lived. It was very much controlled by, in many of the societies at that time, pagan gods. There were many gods for this and gods for that. And of course, we know that in Scripture, the Jewish people, they were monotheistic, meaning one God, and they believed that He created everything. So we would very likely see a beginning of a very simple and primitive philosophy in the reverence shown at all times, and of early man when he was asleep. And it would be easy to feel what he did at that time, that everything was a great mystery for him. They certainly didn't have the science that we do now, and a lot of answers to things that would have mystified them. So it's a natural progression that they would have chalked it up to something beyond them, something greater than them. But this mystery of sleeping certainly is enhanced by the phenomena, a dream, which accompanies it. Now, primitive people unable to explain the psychology of dreaming or to discover the causes of sleep observe that whereas man can, when awake, he can control his thoughts and fancies. And yet, when he's sleeping, he's utterly incapable of doing that. He can't bring, and we can't bring, for instance, dreams as we might wish. Let's say we were having a bad day at work, and we wanted to kind of erase that and make it where everything clicked into place, and the boss came back, congratulated us, told us we're going to get a great raise. If we were having problems with the coworkers, that's going to be all ironed out. And we can't say, okay, this is what I'll dream tonight, and then make it better than it was today in reality. So we don't have that capacity. And we don't have the capacity of directing and ruling those things that affect our faculties to dream. So we can't, I'd like to dream about that issue at work, so I'm going to try to consciously set this up during the daytime that I'll have a decent dream. So because we can't do that, because early man couldn't do things like this, and we still can't today as far as dreams are concerned, it was easy to be led to a supernatural agency, as we were speaking, for the reasons of these dreams, because then it was easy to chalk it up to gods in the plural. Now, remember, we're talking about a lot of pagan gods at this time, and that they influenced the sleep. So we know the early paganism that the power that these gods had was believed to manifest itself in natural effects. The easiest examples are things like thunderstorms and lightning, earthquakes, the storms that we get here on Earth that now science has explained many things. And these were messages which were supposed to be written in the heavens. And that way they could send out these gods, their communication to men in dreams. So if they could use nature, they could certainly use dreams to communicate to the people what these gods wanted. So the persuasion arose that people that were favored by frequent dreams were sacred, and they were chosen as intermediaries between the deity and the man. And you can see how this will all progress. It must have been very common to follow that domino effect. So far from being cast aside by advancing civilization, it's funny because the ideas of dreams developed with it and were to a certain extent systemized. And it appears from particular records of ancient peoples of the East that this took place. And they all took it for granted that every dream expressed a divine message. Now, think about that. Every dream expressed a divine message. Now, that's different than what we know today. Most of the dreams came unsought. But occasionally, supernatural communications were solicited by incubation. That is, the person desirous of obtaining a prophetic dream then betook himself to the temple of that deity from whom he expected to get instructions. And he slept there. They do a little ritual preparation, fall asleep, and this deity would then communicate with them. Now, among the shrines known in antiquity for vouchsafing oracles to sleeping worshippers was the temple at Epidaurus, where dreams were obtained in which remedies were revealed to cure diseases, the cave of Trophonius, the temple of Serapis, and that of Hathor. Now, this was near the turquoise mines of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, these are the best known. And as a last means to wrest the dream from a reluctant deity, if you will, magic was also resorted to. And an interesting example of magic formula was for the purpose of obtaining in a Gnostic papyrus of a late date preserved in a Leiden museum, and it was entitled Agathocles Recipe for Sending a Dream. So you can see, and if you were listening to last week's show about the true case of the exorcism of Robbie Mannheim, how easy it was for the people to get involved with something that was so far over their head that they could have opened the door to some serious, serious problems. And we've got to I want to just fast forward a little to our time today, our modern time, because if we tend to make more of the dreams, since we know much more scientifically, psychologically of dreams, and we'll get to that later in the show, than these earlier peoples, that if we read too much into this, we can have some problems. We don't want to open up ourselves to something that we may be sorry for, because a lot of dreams are just a mishmash of, as I mentioned, what happened during the day, psychological stuff. There could be some religious stuff in there. It's very difficult. I just want to make that clear. With dreams, to get exact interpretation, extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. So we've got to be careful. But onward and upward with the ancient peoples here. So the meaning of the divine message in dreams back then was sometimes obvious and unmistakable. And what they thought were these facts were plainly revealed by the deity himself, or, again, as I mentioned earlier, a messenger. So we see in an early Babylonian king, Udea, he received the command to erect a temple, Erinu, to Ninib. And this dream he got recorded, it described what he was supposed to be doing, how he was supposed to be built it, and all these other things. So you've got to, again, you don't know where this is coming from. These earlier people may not have known what they were doing. And, Scripture is pretty clear on stuff like soothsaying and seances and things like that they did in the age of spiritualism in the 1800s here that was popular in the United States and Europe. And you've got to be very careful because of what you can channel. So these earlier peoples could have been very well channeling things that they had no idea what was going on. So because, as you know, the demonic is very real and Satan is very real, and it is a spiritual battle. So we have to be careful in our time of delving into the dreams. Remember, these were pagan people, so they were open to all this because they believed that these gods influence everything in their lives and in nature itself. And again, it's the plurality. It's not the monotheistic God of the chosen people, the Jewish people. And they've found through history many manuals in Assyria and Babylonia that had the contents on how to understand the principles followed in dream interpretation, something we do want to, again, stay away from. So you can see these earlier cultures put a great deal of stock in dreams, much more than we do now. But we've got to be, again, careful when we're trying to interpret this in a supernatural order, because many dreams do not come in a supernatural order. Now, we mentioned the Assyrians and Babylonia, where these manuals were found on interpretation of dreams, but they weren't just the only ones. So to chalk it up as just as they were pure pagans and didn't know any better, because much more refined and much more so-called culture people came, like the Eastern peoples, like the Greeks and Romans. And they also attached religious significance to dreams. And many of the Greeks, that you can see these traces of the dreams and the influence it had on them in their classical literature. Homer and Herodotus thought it natural that the gods should send dreams to men. It was very natural to them, even to deceive them for the accomplishment of higher ends. And you can see this in the works of like Plato. Plato didn't actually believe that a god would try to deceive men, but he did admit that dreams may come from gods. So you see already here in the Greek peoples, the Eastern peoples, that some people believe this about the dreams and the gods, and others believe something different. And Aristotle also believed that there was divine value in dreams. And the teaching of the Stoics, the famous Greek Stoics, they were along those same lines. So you see this and how it could easily develop, and these were cultured people for that time, into superstition. And this, when we see this belief in the practice of the ancient peoples, it's easier for us then to judge the belief and practices recorded in the Bible, because it's all over the Bible. Now, God entered in Scripture, and I mentioned one case earlier with St. Joseph, into communication with man through dreams. He did it in Numbers. He did it in Job. He did so in Daniel. And divine revelation through dreams occurred frequently in not just the Old, but in the New Testament. We see the dreams of Abimelech in Genesis, and of Jacob in Genesis. Solomon had a dream. Nebuchadnezzar, certainly. As I mentioned, Daniel. Joseph. St. Paul. And God is said to appear himself in only a few instances, as to Abimelech, and to Jacob, to Solomon, to Daniel. And we look at this, and when we see the Ancient of Days that they speak of in this connection, this has got to be understood as God. God has spoken through angels. We certainly know this with the angel Gabriel and his appearance to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So God uses angels, and he has used, in the Bible records other dreams, some prophetic, that he uses to communicate with his people. And there are some circumstances that were prophetic, that without doubt cannot be doubted, that belong to God in their dreams. So we see this in the Bible. And there's no reason for us to believe, especially in our modern age, that God cannot use dreams as a means of manifesting his will to man. God is all-powerful, and he loves us. We know this. And at times, he discloses his purposes through not only supernatural means, but also natural means. Now, dreaming as a natural psychophysiological phenomena has laws. And because God is the creator, and no matter how obscure these laws are to us, to man, they are established by God. And they obey his bidding. Everything, right? That's what we believe as Catholic Christians. God is the creator of everything. But our problem, being man, is that we are easily deluded. And it is needful that God, in using natural causes, should supply us with evidence that he will make his intervention unmistakable. Now, sometimes this evidence is manifested to the dreamers, and at other times to an interpreter. And if they're from God, they're not going to fail. And this is where communications by dreams is one of the ways that God can select to make known his designs to us. So you can't, in that regard, say that dreams are not of a supernatural order. Now, I'm talking here, of course, in the biblical sense, and the dreams that we know, because we believe through our Holy Catholic Church that the Bible is, infallible. It's God's written word. So we can take that to the bank, so to speak. And in that way, all dreams that are recorded in Holy Scripture actually came unsought. So God is the initiator here. And this is what we can, hold as true. And what we've got to be careful in our lives right now is that if we think that all our dreams, especially if we have religious dreams or dreams that seem so vivid, because we have them, right? We have dreams that are so vivid that they can wake us up at the middle of the night. I'm not just talking about the nightmares, but I'm talking about the dreams that, I don't know if the right word to use is pleasant, but dreams that are not exactly, terrifying like a nightmare. They are so vivid that they can even wake us up. And we could lean to the fact that, geez, that's got to be God for sure, because that seems so real and so true to me. And it was, what maybe I've been praying for and an answer. And that's where we've got to be a little bit careful with our dream interpretation, because that's where we run into trouble. Now, we talked that dreams may be caused by spiritual agents such as God or angels, and indirectly even the devil. Now, you can see this happening too with St. Thomas Aquinas and the medieval theologians, that they begin to expand as they got knowledge of sleep and dreams, that maybe these are not all from God. And what they was concerned about at that time was that people wanted to know, and still do today, I mentioned spiritual movement in the 1800s, they wanted to know the future. And that's when divination starts to take place, and we've got to be very careful about that. We've got to be careful about that. So we must watch what we're doing with that, because that was the purposes of seances. They wanted to contact their loved ones. The people probably meant well. that they were heartbroken that their loved ones were gone. They wanted to know, are they alive somewhere? Is there an afterlife? What's this about? And other people certainly would want to know the future because it would enable them to have power. And that is never a good thing, because that control over people, we're starting to use things for self-gaining, to gain some type of power over people. So basically, we got to watch about something like that. Now, when we speak about dreams too, people they want to, again, there's many reasons why people maybe want to hold on to certain dreams. It could be some type of comfort. It could be something they're looking for, and they have these dream analysis. And, it's very, very tricky business, even if you go to respected members of clergy, because it's tough when a dream may be coming from God, or as I mentioned, not. And you would need someone that is definitely theologically trained with the teachings of the magisterium. And that's got to be essential if you're looking for dream analysis. But it's probably best to stay away from something like that. Because one's conscious life, that we live in a reality, that we're awake, and we go through the moments of our day. And what's manifested later at night, let's say in our dreams, it's going to be problematic, because many, 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 many dreams are not guided by rationality, but reflect a multitude of influences that are difficult to categorize with any certitude. And that's why it's so tough to analyze these dreams, because there could be many, many, many factors that are influencing our dreams at night or when we sleep in the daytime. Because when we look at nature, what are the nature of dreams that we have? Well, basically, it's an illusory psychic activity. And it's particularly of a visual nature that occurs during our sleep. Whether, I leaning toward, of course, at night, or most people, but there are people that sleep during the daytime that work different shifts, that they work late at night, and their dream comes during the day. But it's essentially, these dreams, a psychological phenomena with many philosophical, religious, and moral implications. Goes without saying. But now we know so much better than those earlier cultures, where we just reflected a little bit on their history, because now we have many scientific findings on dreams. And they have shown the science to involve perception, creative and reproductive imagination, association of ideas and images, memory and emotion. Now, let's just take a quick thing. We have images, memory, and emotion that we mentioned, and an association of ideas. How many times have you and I had a dream where something happened earlier in the day, or even a day before, and we dreamt about that night or the next night or so after? And we remember that. So something that may not be supernatural there, that is something in our psychology, something in that dream, that we had that association, that we had that reproductive imagination that triggered something. I've had dreams too where I watched a TV show or something like that. I didn't think it affected me or anything like that. Maybe it was trying to think back, maybe a gangster movie or something like that. And doggone it, if a couple nights later next time, it was like the gangsters were after me or something. So, obviously that's not supernatural. That should be pretty simple. I watched this show like The Untouchables or something like that, and boom, I was back in the 1920s and in Chicago or something like that. So, that's just something that triggered in some way my emotion, my memory. I'm not a scientist and I don't know, but, I know enough that was certainly not a supernatural thing. That was what we're just talking about, this reproductive imagination or association. And it's interesting because in dreams, and I'm sure this has happened to you because it's happened to me, that we think and reason in these dreams. Now, it may be on a superficial or on a critical level, and this is important in relation to moral relevance and what one does in the midst of a dream. And what I'm getting at is, have you ever dreamed that you were in a moral situation? And you knew in your dream that this, if you do it, leads to a sin, and this is what you should do. And you choose something in that dream. And we hope it's the good choice. So we have dreams like that. And so at times we're aware of a type of choosing, if you will, within dreams, such as resistance to temptation. Let's say you dreamed about some of your friends were going to embezzle some money at work, and they wanted you to come in with it and go on the computer and doctor up some data, and you refuse that. You know, that's part of your dream, a resistance to temptation. So that's that choosing. But willed acts, they don't stem from free decision-making ability, but from behavioral habits and automatic response. So that could be what they are. Especially if you have a good moral background, good moral conscience, and you're trying to live a good life, that these continue on in your dreams. Okay? So the critical powers of the mind, such as reality testing and decision-making, are greatly impaired in dreaming. So we've got to be careful there. And that accounts for a lot of incoherent and chaotic nature of many dreams. Because how many times have you dreamed or I've dreamed, and we wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, what crazy dreams. Those didn't make any sense at all. And that's what's going on here. Because that's very natural with dreams, because of those critical powers of the mind. And in the dream, the distinction between reality and imagination, it's lost, or at least it's impaired at best. So that's what we were saying. You know, we have these factors, this reproductive imagination, this memory, emotion. So they confuse the line between reality and imagination in these dreams. So it's impaired. So that's a lot of the psychological nature of dreams. Now, what we know is that dreams then can be natural, or as we talked about, and in some cases in the early ancients, we mentioned scripture, so we know that's true, these dreams, to Joseph and Daniel and people that had these dreams. Then they are supernatural, which means, again, that their origin lies in God, angels, or demons. Now, other dreams can be induced by hypnosis, which is interesting. But what causes dreams it seldom is it traced to one well-defined external or internal stimulus. Seldom. But they are brought about by many interacting factors. Again, perceptual, emotional, motivational, physiological, all of that nature. And we know science has told us that dreaming occurs in cycles following the fluctuation of sleep stages. So when a dreamer emerges from the stage of deep sleep, in an average night's sleep, a person dreams from 1 to 2 hours, with dreams distributed, they tell us now, in this stage, in 3 to 5 periods. And these dreams last anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And then each sleep period is followed at intervals of about 90 minutes. So these dreams then fluctuate in all these cycles that we have, science tells us. And they are primarily, and you would know this, made up of visual imagery. Now, most of the images are black and white. The content of dreams is usually very personal and intimate, and has to do with one's attitudes toward oneself and toward important people in one's environment. That it goes without saying. But some people, and this is an interesting, dream in color. I dream in color, which is interesting, and maybe you do. And definitely many of my dreams have definitely been emotional content. And they can go from these incredible fantasies to nightmares. And these preponderance of the nightmares, these unpleasant dreams, can be caused by fear or anger or sadness or one of those triggers. And then, you know, dreams of sex and aggression, very frequent, very frequent. So these are all what science tells us now of dreams, that these all happen. Now, what about interpretation? Because that's what many people are interested in. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, the dream interpretation goes way, way back, way, way back. We mentioned Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. All of these Eastern cultures commented on dream interpretation. But too, with the early cultures, we must remember that many of them were very, very superstitious. So when we look at interpretation, we take a quick thing here on St. Augustine and St. Thomas. Now, St. Augustine taught that he believed that the possibility of God speaking to a person through their dreams, and also that some dreams may have a psychological significance as they reflect the physiological or mental condition on the dreamer. So he admits that. And he said, and I'll quote him here, he said, "Men dream what they need." Now, so he believed in that they could be supernatural, but some, may not be. It's tough. It's tough to determine. And St. Thomas dealt with it in connection with his treatment of superstition. St. Thomas, identified 4 causes of dreams: mental activity, the physical disposition of the body, environmental conditions, and then the spiritual causes, which be God, angels, and demons. So you can see these 2 guys, they were ahead of the curve, because a lot of what they thought, science has proven to be true. So, and they certainly didn't have the science that we have at our disposal right now. Okay, now let's go to the psychologists. Now, Freud, Jung, and Adler, they all had their psychological perspectives on dream interpretation. Matter of fact, Freud wrote an entire work entitled Interpretation of Dreams. That was around 1900. And for the most part, this work severely limited dream interpretation to the identification of unfulfilled, you guessed it, sexual wishes. And he also stressed the principle of free association and typical symbolism. So that was Freud's interpretation of dream. It was all from the libido that was, unfulfilled, that had these desires, but they were restrained, wouldn't be let out, so they were let out in dreams. And Carl Jung, he was the first to analyze the dreams of a person in a sequential series. He treated them as a meaningful whole, and he interpreted them on the basis of how consistent they were internally. So Jung, distinctly different than Freud, interpreted dreams as the manifestation of our whole personality. So he varied his interpretations, Jung did, according to a personality type. So Jung saw dreams influenced not only by past experiences, as with Freud, but also by present problems and future plans. So not just something that was, straining in this libido, something to get out, to be free, but that included several factors on that personality that influenced our dreams. Now, Adler also saw this past, present, and future influence on dreams. But his main emphasis was on how a person's lifestyle reflected in his dreams. So that's something from the psychologist, when you're looking at this, that you might want to think about. Not so much maybe Freud, but at least with Jung and Adler, when you look at your personality and look at the factors in your life that are influencing you psychologically, and see and try to look at your dreams in that way so you don't get too worked up about them one way or the other. So in that way, you won't stress out about this and maybe misinterpret what your dream was saying. Because you would think in our day and age today that many people would kind of, realize, okay, this dream was that, and, not a big deal, or this nightmare was this, or why did I dream about that, and not get hung up. But there still are people that really kind of let their dreams bother them, and may, in cases, let them guide their decisions in reality, in their waking moments. So we've got to be very careful with that, because as you can listen to some of the things from the psychologists, many of the factors are a mishmash of many different things that may not have much significance in our dreams, but again, are not based on real activity that we consciously make that we would during our waking hours. So there's all these factors that could come in, which means they can be distorted. So we don't want to get too worked up. And so with some of the moral considerations with this interpretation, we look at it from a Christian standpoint, and we see that Christian interpretation of dreams conforms to some principles. Now, let's take a few. One, the dreams may be a legitimate vehicle of divine revelation. In this case, God himself is providing the proof and attesting to the divine origin of these dreams. We see this during Scripture. And that means God then will also provide an interpretation of our dream. Now, the majority of our dreams are what? Now, we talked about this. Natural phenomena, and they lack any special religious meaning. Now, remember, many of our dreams, they don't have any meaning, any special meaning. They're just that conglomeration of all those things, our memory, our emotion, what we interpret, what could have happened to us during the day, something, a trigger, a show, a song, something. So we don't, again, want to get too worked up. And here's the biggie for us as Christians, that superstitious divination through dreams is severely forbidden by God and actually is an immoral practice. Now, that's what we've got to watch for, because in general, the techniques of dream analysis, they're not in themselves immoral. The moral dimension comes into play when considering divination of moral culpability and the use of dreams in one's spiritual life. That's what we've got to watch. So what does that mean? Okay, this culpability in use of dreams and spirituality. Well, divination is the foretelling of the future by means of a dream. Now, we mentioned that before. And it's only legitimate when we are absolutely sure that the dream comes from God. And that's where we've got to be careful, because we may not be sure. And we know that Scripture talks against divination. So our attitude then should be the same as in the case of private visions and revelation. So the church, when the church, is a Catholic, for instance, let's use to clarify that. When we read about a mystic, or we'll take something like Fatima, the church gives its okay. When the church approves a mystic, like St. John Paul the Great was a mystic, St. Catherine of Siena, certainly St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Fatima, Lourdes, we've talked about in the show. When we look at private visions, revelation, as Catholics, we're not required to believe them like we are, say, in the resurrections of Jesus Christ. That goes, you have to believe that. There are some doctrines that must be believed by the faithful, fully believed by the faithful and accepted by the faithful without question. But when we talk about revelation or the private visions, you can gather and aid your spiritual life by looking at them and studying them and having devotions to them. But it doesn't mean, as a Catholic, that you have to follow them or believe them like you do the resurrection or the incarnation of Jesus or the Assumption of Mary or Immaculate Conception of Mary. So you don't have to believe those revelations or private visions. That's a big difference. So when divine intervention in a dream is excluded, then divination then is an act of superstition. See, because it's not from God now, it becomes an act of superstition because it involves either explicitly or implicitly an attempt to predict the future by means of what? And here's where it gets bad: demonic powers. And that's what I meant earlier in the show. The ancients did not know what possibly they could be delving into, where we should, in this 21st century of ours, have a little bit more knowledge on that we can channel and open up a Pandora's box of trouble for ourselves. So this is one of the reasons you can't do this and go to psychics. And we talked about this on other shows, and palm readers, because you're trying to control something that God is in control of. And now we're trying to alter that, to make it ours. In essence, to try to become like God by reading into the future. And remember, I mentioned I'm not trying to let the people off the hook of the spiritual movement way back when. But, you know, there's only so much. People feel sad when they lose their loved ones. There's no question about that. Whether you're alive today or back 500 years ago. People always had that question: what happens after this life? It's a biggie. But it doesn't give us the excuse to go to mediums to get some type of consolation. You know, our consolation should be in God. Our consolation should be in Him, not in trying to find out the future for our own thing. Again, remember, some of the things with the future is just the same old thing with people, trying to gain power over people, to use them for their own gratification. And that's a big sin. That's a big sin. So that's where we can go with this in these interpretation of dreams when we get involved in any divination. Now, the gravity of that sin, certainly I mentioned the ancients, maybe they weren't, hopefully, you know, ignorance is bliss. But we certainly may not be let off the hook that easy, because we know much more about dreams now. So the gravity of sin depends on, again, like a lot of grave sin, on the amount of awareness we have. And we are more aware than the ancients today, or at least we should be. And we've got to be careful when involving this about the degree of certainty and about these predictions and more or less explicit intention of regulating one's life according to dreams, because that's when we're going to start to sin. Because we've got to realize that we talked a little bit about tonight, all these factors that go into our dreams at night. And they're very unstable. And they're not, you know, in many cases, not rational, not conscious thoughts that we choose and make like we do when we're awake and living our lives in the so-called real world. So this mishmash is certainly not infallible and is very fallible, very mistake-prone. So to live one's life according to our dreams, we can be in a world of trouble. Because when we look, we see ignorance and an implicit belief in some infallible natural means of knowing secrets and predicting the future, such as telepathy or precognition. It can diminish one's culpability of collusion with the devil. So that is what probably we hope, anyway, with the ancients, that kind of, you know, mitigated some of that sin with the divination. But for us, unless we are ignorant and have that same type of implicit belief in natural means of knowing stuff and predicting the future, you know, we got to be very careful there, because we may just be kidding ourselves And we don't want to give the devil any foothold. I mean, all you had to do was listen to the story last week. And that's a true story. And it's not the only, Robbie Mannheim's exorcism is not the only exorcism story. I mean, this is how people get possessed, full possession by the devil. They start delving into things like this. Now, for one's moral responsibility, merit or punishment, they can't be acquired through dream behavior. Because I mentioned man's ability to think and choose is so reduced during sleep that he is not morally responsible for whatever may happen. So, I mean, if you had a dream and you committed a mortal sin, let's say you killed somebody or anything like that. Again, you're not, you're not culpable. Now, that you probably laugh a little bit and say, well, that's obvious. Well, for some people, it may not be. There's a lot of factors that go in here. And remember what we were saying about the psychologists like Jung and Adler. They determine that the personality is a big part of the people's dream. So there are people that believe possibly that what they did in their dream makes them culpable. Now, if you do have that type of thing, and you are prone to that, what is recommended is a good practice before going to sleep, and this is a bad idea for anybody, sprinkle one's bed with holy water and read a couple lines out of sacred scripture. And certainly ask God's protection and ask God to dispose, his grace upon you. And again, I mentioned the science today, which does so many things. Even with the science we have, dream analysis is at best beset by many limitations. And one is the lack of knowledge as to how the unconscious and conscious life of an individual are related. I mean, we're not even close to some of that stuff. I remember martial art training and stuff like that. That was one of the things to get this energy, this chi, and to get the subconscious and conscious mind to work together. And you've got to, again, with things like this, be cautious, because when you're trying to regulate your dreams, to use as a technique of spiritual guidance, again, you can open up the door to a world of trouble, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. It is much better, in my opinion, and I'm certainly no expert in dreams, to just let them go and not get too worked up in that. When we look at some of the dreams in the Bible, they were definitely supernatural. I mean, you've got so many cases in the Bible that, that goes without question. But we often don't have that type of dream. And don't forget, the Jewish people at that time, they thought many things happen in you in life and foolish fancies that affected dream. But mostly for the Jewish people, they accepted dreams as supernatural manifestations. That is probably not true today, So it's very tricky business. And, even in the Bible days, and then we see that many of these cultures people were superstitious. The meaning of dreams was obscure. And they only had their wisest men trying to explain their significance. We see this certainly with Daniel. And so even back then, in that time, even they were cautious about this. So even, and it was definitely supernatural in many, many cases, we know through Scripture, and during that time with that monotheistic culture of the Jews. So when we look at that, that should be a good gauge for us not to delve too deeply into the dreams, because even the people at that time were cautious about, and they believed in the supernatural, that God was actually communicating them, which he did, and they were sure of it, but even they still showed caution. So how much more should we? So that's very, very important in our dreams, because, maybe you've run into people that, again, the danger here, and why I wanted to talk about it, is that they let dreams rule their lives and major decisions they make. That is a very, very tough call on an individual's part because of some of the factors that we mentioned tonight. And in addition, that with all the science we have and advances they've made in this type of dream analysis, there are many question marks that are unanswered. So I think our best bet for dreams is to really not make much of them. If they are supernatural in origin, my opinion is probably that God, and just my opinion, and I'm no expert by any way, shape, or form, is that he will let you know. He'll give you a confirmation, or we mentioned earlier tonight that he'll give you an interpreter, which he will put in your path that will remove any doubt. But that's, for most people, I would imagine it's not going to be an everyday occurrence or many times happen often. So that's why it's probably best to let our dreams happen, let these, especially, the nightmares, the ones we don't like, not get too worked up about them. The pleasant dreams that we have, hey, that's all right. That's not a bad thing. I dream sometimes my parents are deceased, and sometimes I dream of our family together. My brother passed away at a young age, and I wake up in the morning and it's like awesome. I dream of my dog sometimes, and it's like we're back in real life, and but I take that for what it's worth. I don't put a lot of stock in a lot of stuff. But when it comes to that, because it could be many factors that influence my dream at night. One thing I will say, though, for myself again only, is that when I have thought that there may have been a dream from God, it usually had to do with a soul that died. And I thought in my dream, and this is, I never had a clear confirmation, but I remember in my brother's case, years after he died, I didn't have any dreams of him. And then within a week, within a couple days, I had a couple dreams of him, and he was at church. And one, I believe, he was in a white robe like an altar boy. And I said, you know what? I wonder if there's something to that. Now, I didn't, again, try to determine future, try to determine this. But what I did was I got these Gregorian masses because I said, maybe there's something there. It doesn't hurt to get your loved ones masses. It's the most powerful thing we can do. So I would say in something like that, if one of your loved ones, it probably, I'm not saying this to go spiritualism and go see a seance person, of course, and try to channel your loved one, but to get masses, that's a pretty good deal, because the masses are a great gift for souls in purgatory. And even if the dream had no supernatural fact, it's not going to hurt to get a mass. So that's where I would probably stay on dreams. And the whole show is just don't take too much, again, my opinion, don't take too much stock. When you get a dream something like that about a loved one that keeps coming up or something, maybe get a mass to them. Just be careful. No palm reader, no palmistry, no divination. Be very cautious. Remember, God is God. We're not. Let him work everything out in our lives. We can't go wrong. So, brothers and sisters, I hope you enjoyed the show. Have a great week. Good night. And God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.